If it was complicated to be a Muslim American before September 11th, 2001, it was definitely more so after that reality pressed Haroon Moghul into the public eye, even as he struggled with his faith, mental health, and identity. He's now written a candid memoir. It's called How to Be a Muslim, An American Story. And it brings Haroon to our studio tonight. Welcome. So nice to meet you.
Thank you.
This book was lovely. I mean, it was heartbreaking. There were many parts where I ended up crying. It's really honest and candid. When you set out to write it, did you think you were going to get that deep?
I wrote it for two reasons. The first was actually a publisher at a university had contacted me and asked me if I would write a book about being an American Muslim for college students. And I had long felt like our stories were not being told, and that many times people would come up to me after a talk and they'd say, what can I read about being Muslim or about Islam or about American Islam? And I had very few things to recommend. And the second reason is actually a story I tell in the book, is at possibly the lowest point in my life when I was actively and pretty consistently suicidal. I went to see a therapist, and she told me that the way to get out of this was to find something about yourself that you love. And I remember recoiling from the suggestion, thinking that it smacked of vanity and narcissism. And she told me that until I found that thing, that I would always be in the same incredibly negative frame of mind where I wouldn't take care of myself or look after myself. And so she said, just start writing and figure out what comes to mind. So I wrote my story. And at some point, the two intersected, because I saw a lot of my story was the story of what it's like to be an American Muslim.
And in the book, you write about the struggle of, I guess, identity, of being a Muslim, but what you just mentioned, loving yourself. Why couldn't the two coexist?
I'm not exactly sure where I picked it up from, but I was raised to believe that that kind of language was somehow contrary to my religion and my culture, that focusing on yourself and caring about yourself and thinking about yourself was the definition of selfishness. And so it was bad, it was taboo, and it was a sign of weakness.
And you write, the first chapter is just mesmerizing. You write about this event that happened where you almost took your life. What happened?
So I had moved to Washington, D.C. to take my dream job when I was 31 years old. It was June. I was working for a prestigious think tank. I finally had a proper salary. I know Canadians can't understand, but I had health insurance. These things are, you know,
monumental.
They're victories.
Yeah, not all of
us.
us. Yeah, monumental.
So,
yeah.
You know, but it was a big deal. And I had been working my rear end off for 5 or 6 years trying to get into this space, and I'd gotten into this space. And I was doing a lot of public speaking. I was traveling, like I was at the center of the universe as far as I was concerned. And I was miserable. My marriage was falling apart. My health was failing. My finances were in pretty sorry shape. And my wife and I ended up agreeing to get divorced. I started a relationship right after that I shouldn't have. Basically one thing to another. And I remember walking one day to my therapist's office, crossing a bridge, hence the cover of the book. And I thought about jumping off. And that's the point at which the story jumps off.
What was your childhood like? Where did you grow up?
My childhood was awkward. I grew up in a small town in Massachusetts and then moved across the border to Connecticut when I was about 10 years old. I was a very sick kid. I had a number of surgeries by the time I was in kindergarten. So I think I was a pretty isolated child, and I was a very different kid compared to everyone around me. I was the only kid who wasn't white or Christian. And you know, my parents were good parents, but they didn't really understand the culture that they dropped me into. And so I felt this constant tension between being the brown Muslim kid and being surrounded by white Christian students. And I will say that I never encountered open racism. I mean, I grew up in New England. It's a pretty liberal, open-minded, tolerant place. Most people looked at me like I was a curiosity. I'm just different. Maybe like a zoo animal, you kind of want to pet me, but not necessarily.
That's so good, though.
You know? Yeah, it's not like a bad identity politics.
Right.
It's kind of like a weird identity politics. But I think the bigger challenge for me was what to do with my parents' background and their heritage, and feeling like if I didn't live up to that, I wasn't just a failure personally, but existentially. And it's kind of hard to convey to someone how incredibly crushing it is to feel like you would fail, not just for this life, but for eternity. And so before you're even able to drive a car, you have this weight on your shoulders, this metaphysical burden.
Where did this come from?
From my parents and their religiosity, the sense that if you don't do X, Y, and Z, and if you don't do it in the right ways, and if you don't do it consistently, then you're not a good Muslim, and if you're not a good Muslim, you're going to hell. And then you balance that against your own personal inclinations and then the world around you. And when you're in high school, when you're that age, you don't really have a very strong sense of self anyway.
And you just want to be like everybody else, right?
Yeah, that's where you get your sense of self from, is from your peers. And it was tough. Yeah.
And then you reach a point where you want to explore some things that you're not supposed to in your household. And that revolves around girls.
Yes.
I would like to read an excerpt from your book about that. I didn't even know Muslims would like talking to girls. We were phenotypically human, but fundamentally and genetically something else. Stronger, lonelier, not sexual, but with more babies.
Yeah.
How so?
Well, so my parents never talked about sex or sexuality. And so one of the key points in my life, one of the great decisions that shaped me as a human being is in 6th grade, every parent got a letter in the mail. They had to sign off and give permission for their students to take sexual health classes. I don't know if they still do that, but they did when I was growing up in New England, where you had to get parental permission. And every single student got parental permission except me. So literally, while all this, the one, so it's like I'm already weird, right? And then you do that to me, which is so unfair.
Yeah.
And so they had to come up with like an alternate thing for me to do. So for an hour a week, when the students were taking sex ed classes, I went to the library and did a report on the solar system, which you can't even make up, which is amazing, right? Like I was like a little dorky astronaut, right? While everyone else was learning about sex, I was learning about Saturn, which is awful. And I mean, what I guess I'm trying to say is I grew up believing that religion and sexuality were at complete odds, and that human sexuality was itself taboo. And so obviously I knew where kids came from, but I believed that marriage was something you sort of forced yourself to go through. And so when I first found myself attracted to women, I was deeply confused, because I didn't assume that that was something that would actually exist or be a thing. And it's a really weird thing when your mind is telling you you're not supposed to want something, and your body's telling you you're supposed to want something, and you have literally no one to talk to about it. And it sounds a little bit absurd now, but at the time it was shattering, because I felt like I was wanting things I was not supposed to want.
So eventually you have your first kiss.
Yes.
Or someone kisses you rather.
Yes.
Because you didn't really
I was really smooth, yeah.
You were kind of, yeah. So what happened after that? How did you feel about yourself?
Like right after the kiss?
Well, after you
Well, she went back in the house, and I stood there like an idiot for 10 minutes until I realized her father was probably somewhere inside and I should leave. It felt really good. Yeah, it felt really good.
But after you thought about it, and
no, it still felt really good. I was like, forget that. I'm like, shut up, brain. I dismissed it out of hand. I mean, it caught up with me later, I'm sure, but it felt so right and so comfortable that I kind of pushed everything else to the side. And it took a long time for that religious voice in the back of my head to rebound back and say,
but you kind of like distanced yourself from your religion, didn't you know?
I did, yeah, in order to do it. And so I went through this spell of atheism, which was very utilitarian atheism. And I know people have different reasons for believing what they believe, so I'm not trying to comment on why anyone believes what they believe. But for me personally, it was like, I want to do these things, but my religion says I shouldn't do these things. So if I can just get my religion to shut up for like 10 minutes and go sit in a corner, then I can go do these things. So I told my religion to shut up and go sit in the corner. And so I convinced myself that I was an atheist. And it was a very tactical move so that I could go do then what I wanted to do, which was like date and go to parties and drink and have friends and have fun.
So you essentially became two Haroons, right?
Yeah, and I think for a lot of my life, I felt like two people. And I don't know if that's something we all feel, or if it's a particular ailment of people who maybe grow up between cultures. But there's been this sense throughout my life that there's the Haroon who should do things and the Haroon who wants to do things. And they're constantly at odds. And I know obviously we always are supposed to struggle with the morality, but I felt it pretty sharply.
Now eventually, just to fast forward, you go to Saudi Arabia. How did that experience affect you?
Saudi Arabia is an interesting place.
Yeah.
I thought it was going to be like a really cool road trip where I'd get to I don't know, learn about my religion in a friendly environment. And I don't really get into the politics of it in the book because this is not a political book. But I went because my brother invited me to go visit Mecca and Medina, the Muslim holy sites in Saudi Arabia. And at that point, I was basically an atheist, but I kind of went along because I thought, this is, I mean, if it doesn't move me here, religion that is, then I've realized something and I can then move on in my life to a point where I'm no longer a religious person. And I remember having this epiphany in Medina and Saudi Arabia outside the tomb of the Prophet Muhammad, where it occurred to me that being an atheist wasn't necessarily something problematic for me, but the idea of not believing in Muhammad struck me as deeply painful. And that was the first moment in my religious life and my personal life that I found something of Islam that actually resonated with me personally, that wasn't, it didn't feel like an imposition. It felt like this attachment to the figure of Muhammad as prophet was something that grew out of me and that wasn't pushed into me.
You once were asked what drew you to Islam, and a single name came to mind. Who?
Is a guy named Jalabib. He's a complete footnote in history. And his name, we don't even know if he had a name, but the name that he goes by means stunted or small, which is probably like a pejorative nickname that stuck because he didn't have a name. And he was just someone who was completely on the margins of 7th century Medina, who, when the Prophet Muhammad arrived in Medina, became a Muslim and joined this kind of burgeoning Muslim community. And I always identified with him because I was a sick kid and I felt like the outsider. And I was amazed that Muhammad, as a prophet who was kind of, busy at the level of statecraft and building a society and a community and had all these very powerful converts around him.
But he claimed him.
Claimed him and went out of his way for him and actually buried him with his own hands. And once said that he is of me and I am of him. And I found that really touching. And I know that when people talk about religion or Islam, it tends to always go to Islam or extremism, foreign policy, terrorism. Those are the hot topics with Islam. And very few people hear about these kinds of human stories, which are where I think a Muslim's attachment to the religion actually comes from, is not from the big picture stuff or the sexy stuff or the scary stuff. It's from that really emotional, touching, intimate stuff.
So do you think that because maybe it's like a question of where do I belong? Do I belong to anybody? And in that story, you felt like you belonged to somebody?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I think actually, as you were saying that, it occurred to me that, I was just talking to a friend a few days ago about a smear campaign he was facing from elements within the Muslim community. And he said, it's not my community. Kind of, he was fed up, right? Like he was sick of the way things were, and it is exhausting, right? Being Muslim in America is exhausting because, on the one hand you've got kind of like Donald Trump, but then the other hand you've got the Islamic extremism, and then just the suffocating nature of some communities that are still really cloistered and really parochial, and so you kind of feel like you're in the middle of nowhere. And what your question brings to mind is, so then why even belong to it? And I think sometimes it's that emotional attachment that you don't want to let go of something that you feel is true or you feel connected to. But sometimes it's also that you feel like you're part of a community that doesn't actually exist. It's a virtual community or it's an imagined community, right? So I belong to the Prophet Muhammad, who's obviously not here. But I feel more of a kinship there than I do to many existing Muslim communities or Muslim spaces.
Eventually, you are diagnosed with having bipolar. When you heard that, did you have a sense of relief, or did you have more questions? Did you deny it? Did you accept it?
I remember it was a phone call. So I went to see a family friend who was a psychiatrist and a psychologist, which incidentally is a great career choice. It's much better than being a writer because you get paid much better.
And health benefits.
That's right, and health benefits, right? We had that until Obamacare began to kind of fray around the edges. We're not supposed to talk about the Orange Man. So, yeah, diagnosis. I was also later diagnosed with ADD, if you can't tell. So I went to see her. We talked for 2 hours. I thought that the stuff I was going through was completely exceptional. Like nobody had ever gone through this stuff. And I don't mean that in this like, I'm so amazing and important, but literally, I'm gonna tell her my problems and she's gonna look at me like.
Because you felt like a failure.
Yeah, and I didn't grow up around any kind of this stuff, right? So there was no language of psychology or mental health or therapy. I just remember I was driving a car down the highway back from New York one night, and I was really depressed. I was dropping out of law school, and I felt like my life was going nowhere. And I thought about driving the car into a concrete pillar holding up an overpass. And so even I, like as cloistered as I was, as suffocated as I was, knew that that's not normal to want to kill yourself with a car. So I called her and I said, hey, can I talk to you? And I went to see her at her house, and we talked for a few hours. And she made me describe everything I was going through. And the next day she called me and she said, oh, you're bipolar, blah, blah, blah. Like she gave just a few details. And she said, I'll just put you on some medication. And this is the medication. Do you have any questions? And I don't think I had any questions because I was like, wait, how did you, like, we just talked for 2 hours. Like, and then later, like, I've learned that actually I'm a pretty stereotypical case, right? It's not like I'm that special. But at the time, it was like, oh, I'm not special. What does it mean that I'm not special?
You also mentioned that you weren't maybe like a good Muslim or something like that.
Yeah,
right.
So I thought it was like, there was something about me that made me this way that was terrible. So special, not in a good way, special in a bad way. For her to just say, oh, you just fit the profile of someone who's bipolar and that's a normal thing and you can just take some medication and you'll be better, I didn't know what to do with that. Because then it meant that all these thoughts I was thinking about myself and religion might have been irrelevant or even beside the point. And to just say, oh, just take a pill, you'll be better. At first it was unsettling, and then it was, well, if I'm bipolar and I have a mental illness, then doesn't that mean that I'm somehow a religious failure? And then does that mean that if I take the medication, I'm basically giving into that? Like, am I saying that, like, I should be able to fix myself religiously, and if I can't fix myself religiously, then even trying to fix myself some other way is just compounding the problem. It's making it worse. So if I can't make it better, why make it worse? So I stayed on medication for a little while. I eventually dropped off the medication, and then, yeah.
So once you found out that you were bipolar, you know, your crisis of faith, the questions of identity, do you think that this was a product of your depression or the other way around?
I wonder about that all the time. I don't know. I do know, I mean, again, I'm not an expert in mental illness, so I can't pretend like I know what I'm talking about, but I'll just say it anyway because look at who the president is. There's this new age of non-expertise. I know that when people succumb to a depressive episode, they become more susceptible to depressive episodes in the future, right? So once you have a depressive episode, you can have more and you will have more. And so there's a danger in not having them treated because there is a compounding effect. I wonder if part of the problem was that because I didn't believe in the language of mental health, I made it worse. And so in that sense, how I thought about religion and about myself and about my culture and identity made it worse, because by preventing me from getting treatment, I not only suffered in ways that maybe I shouldn't have or wouldn't have had to, but then set myself up for future suffering. Because every time I had that kind of crash, I told myself that it's because of me, and I discounted the value of actually being in treatment.
You went to Dubai.
Yes.
And you had a dream. Tell us about it.
First, everyone should go to Dubai because it's like this weird nightmare utopia of the future. It's like a Muslim Las Vegas.
I know, that's what I was going to say. That's how you describe it.
It's the Muslim Las Vegas. It's a very weird, it looks like a spaceship landed in the desert and then got full of Arabs. And it's weird.
And you can wear whatever you want.
You can wear whatever you want.
For the men.
It's really hot.
Yeah.
So, you know, I went to Dubai because my life at that point had pretty much tanked. And I left that job in DC, and I was living with my brother. And, you know, I had this dream where I went to pray at NYU, which is my undergraduate college. And I went to the Muslim prayer space at New York University, and it was a different prayer space. And I ended up in a back room, and I met a very prominent Sufi sheikh, a Sufi leader, someone who basically an expert in the mystical side of Islam, for lack of a better term. And he gives me this bracelet as a gift, which is like a plain metal bracelet. I don't know what it represented or anything like that. And I told a good friend of mine, and I said, hey, I saw this person in a dream. I should maybe go see him in real life. There's got to be a connection there. And he kind of pointed out that since I had no money, it was probably not the best idea for me to try to fly to Jordan, since that would not even get off the ground. And, you know, so he said, why don't you see someone in in the UAE, like you can find someone. And so he pointed me to a guy named Habib Ali Jifri, who's a prominent Yemeni Sufi scholar, authority based in Abu Dhabi, in the capital of the UAE. And I went to see him one night at like 3 in the morning, and I had this 2-hour, really intimate conversation with him about basically like it was like a therapy session where I just offloaded onto him like everything I've ever done wrong or everything I've failed at. And he listened to the whole thing. I'd never encountered this in a religious leader before. He let me kind of just dump everything onto him. And he gave me some spiritual counsel, which I don't know if I should share because then it kind of like makes the book a complete moot point. But he gave me some spiritual counsel in a way that kind of just, I don't know, it's like he knew exactly what I needed to hear at that very moment in my life. And he gave me that and nothing more.
And also, I think he told you that you should love yourself.
He did, as he was walking out the door, which was really weird. Because the whole journey, in a sense, started with a therapist telling me that you have to love yourself. And incidentally, this is a woman who, when she was giving birth, she was blinded. So there were complications during her labor, and she lost her eyesight as a result. And I remember as she was talking to me, I was thinking, like, how is she not
Angry?
just so consumed with, like, how would you survive something like that and not be consumed in anger and hate? And how would you have a relationship with your child? You know, and then how would your child have a relationship with you when something like that happens? And she told me all the same, you have to find something about yourself to love, and told me to start writing. And several months later, I'm in a completely different country. I would have never seen that life trajectory happen. And it's now 5 in the morning, and Habib Ali is leaving his office, going into the private quarters of his house. And as he leaves, he says, you have to love yourself.
And we don't want to say what he shared with you, but how did that affect you afterwards? Understanding yourself as a person and even maybe understanding your depression.
It kind of broke me in a good way, because it took a lot of things I believed about myself and took a hammer to them because of who he was, and that I couldn't dismiss him as someone who wasn't religiously or culturally grounded. And for him to say that was important at a really low point in my life made me think, well, if it is, then what does that mean? And to be honest with you, I think I'm still struggling with that, because there's still what I want and then what I think I should want. And even now, I find it really hard to assert what I want to do or who I want to be. But I've begun to see, and it's a point that I make in the book, that, you know, when we don't assert ourselves, sometimes we do it out of niceness. Like, I won't tell you what I want or how I'm feeling because I don't want to hurt your feelings. But when we suppress ourselves, we don't negate ourselves. We just hold ourselves down. And when we come back up, it's all the uglier for it. And so,
You went to a different school for other people, you know?
well, and you cause people pain, right? By not telling people what you want, you don't actually spare them, you make it worse for them, because then you build up resentment towards them. And that kind of hurtfulness is an interesting byproduct of a kind of selfishness, right? That inability to assert yourself is actually selfish, because you're ultimately causing yourself pain and other people pain. And so it's something I think I'm still trying to figure out how to make sense of.
How do you feel now, having written the book and, you know, all of the stuff that you held so close to your chest, everybody has access to it?
A colleague of mine at the Shalom Hartman Institute, he told me that once you write a book and it's published and it's out there, it's no longer yours. So just disabuse yourself of any idea that this book belongs to you anymore. On the one hand, it's really tough. You know, I went to Houston this past Tuesday. I did a book reading at a bookstore down there. And people who had read the book had been out for a week by that point, and asked me really personal questions about myself. And I was a little bit like, excuse me.
I just met you.
Yeah, like, know your place, thank you. But then I was like, oh yeah, I wrote that in the book. But then I will also say that one of the reasons why I wrote this is because I wanted people who are going through things like this to not feel like they're alone. And a guy I really look up to, one of the most creative thinkers in the modern Muslim world, someone who's come out of the Middle East and really looks at things from a completely different perspective. You know, I wanted to send him a copy of the book. partially because I value his opinion, and then he has like a bazillion Twitter followers. So it's like, if he likes it, then I will sell more copies. And then I'll have health insurance. So everything at the end of the day is health insurance. In America, it's
we're not 21 anymore, right?
Yeah, exactly, right? So, so I sent him a copy of the book. And he responded back several hours later, and he said, I'm reading the chapter you mentioned. He said, I'm reading the first chapter. And he said, where you talk about being suicidal. He said, it really hit home because I was feeling really suicidal right now. And at first I was like, wow, I'm glad that this could be something that made you feel connected to someone. But then I was like, wait, you're feeling suicidal. And I said, from outside, I would have said you had all your stuff together, right? Like, you're a published author and you're like a well-known personality, and like everything in your life seems to be going just fine, which might have been how people looked at me. And it would have never occurred to me that he was going through that kind of thing and that kind of struggle. So you're right, at some level it is hard to put all of myself out there, but then when you hear something like that, you realize that there's a greater value in being open than in hiding.
Do you feel stronger now that you are more open?
Absolutely, I feel stronger for it. I think I had to fall apart in all of those ways to be at a point where I could be comfortable with myself. And I'm of the opinion that maybe sometimes you do need to fall apart. And obviously very carefully, because you don't want to fall apart like too much. But sometimes when we don't fall apart, we just end up living these miserable half-lives.
Your book is wonderful, really.
Thank you.
And it's wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Haroon.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.